Namaste and welcome to everyone. My name is Prema and I am a faculty teacher at Nexus Yoga Institute. And today I will be sharing with you some of the insights and core concepts that I found in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, specifically in relation to part 4, the imprint of trauma. And before we dive into concepts, I would like to invite you to take a comfortable seat wherever it is that your body is in space. Just simply allow the body to become more comfortable than it already is. And allowing your back to be straight and your spine to grow tall. And if you feel comfortable with the eyes open, you can leave them open, but if you prefer to have the eyes closed, you can close them. Just bringing a gentle gaze and focusing in the space behind the eyes, allowing the muscles of the eyes and the nerves to soften. And letting the softening of the space behind the eyes ripple out into the cheekbones, softening the jaw, relaxing the tongue into the bottom of the mouth, letting the jaw soften. And if it's interesting to you, allow your lips to soften into a smile, gentle smile, and noticing what effect that has on your nervous system. Allowing each in-breath to open space and each out-breath to soften. With each in-breath, opening space, allowing breath to flow into those places in the lungs that usually don't receive breath. Deepening more than shallow breathing. And on the exhale, relaxing, releasing, and letting go. Allowing your out breaths to become longer than the in breaths. So really becoming comfortable in that action of release, of emptying out, letting go. There is no need to count the breath. Simply allow the exhale to extend farther than the in-breath. Continuing to gladden the mind by softening the muscles, releasing, relaxing, and letting go. Directing your awareness into the belly, into your stomach, and taking awareness, taking note what is going on inside the belly. There's digestion processes occurring. Letting the belly do its job, allowing the body to enter a state of restoration, digestion, relaxation. And sensing the space within. And bringing your chin towards your chest, slightly opening the back of your neck. And drawing your shoulder blades towards one another so as to open more space in the area behind the neck. And as if you had paint on your nose, at the tip of your nose, begin to draw or paint small circles with your nose. And sense or imagine that you can draw shapes with the tip of your nose, as if you had paint. allowing the head to move in whatever direction it feels right, feels good. Softening the neck, the occipital ridge, softening the jaw. Allowing the head to move however it feels good to move. And then beginning to rotate the shoulders up and back. And bring awareness into your hands as you relax the shoulder blades down towards the ground. Bringing awareness into your hands and allow your hands to touch whatever surface is nearest to the earth. So whether it's your legs or your chair or your cushion or the floor, closest to the ground, and feeling the support of the earth beneath you. Then bringing your hands, cupping your face, so allowing your hands to hold the weight of the head. And wherever your fingertips are, begin to massage your face, letting the fingertips massage the forehead, gently massage your cheekbones, doing whatever movement feels good, allowing the tips of the fingertips to massage the head, maybe to massage the jaw. If it feels good to tap, you can tap. And taking the hands behind your head. If you have a hat like me, you can take it off. If you have a ponytail, and simply allow the fingertips to massage the scalp. Applying as much pressure, as little pressure as you need. Taking the fingers to the occipital ridge, that space that connects your brain to your spine. Back of the neck, massaging your head. Peace fingers come to the space behind the ears that connects the back of the ear to your cranium, massaging there, lots of lymph nodes. Fingertips come to the jaw, small circles here, relaxing the tongue, circles the opposite direction. And dragging the fingers to the cervical bone, clavicle bone. Cervical bone is somewhere else. Good. And letting the hands do any final movements that might feel good. You can comb your hair. The Native American traditions and other traditions have this sense that we hold many memories in our hair. Just releasing that. Bing. Clear the forehead. You can start tapping one arm. If tapping feels good to you, you can also just sweep that arm, moving into a whole self-awakening yoga class. We'll get into the book soon, but this is part of the book, making sure you get the armpit. A nice energetic shower, and moving to the other arm and sensing if you find any difference. Into the armpit, letting go. Beginning to clear the chest. Take a deep breath in, and on the exhale, sigh it out. Deep breath in, and on the exhale, sigh it out. And another deep breath in. And on the exhale, place both palms on top of your chest and sigh it out. Hold the exhale out. Hold it out. Holding the urge to breathe, just emptying out the lungs. Draw your pubic bone towards your tailbone, tailbone to pubic bone. Bring your belly button in and up. Chin comes to chest. Take a deep breath in. And on the exhale, sigh it out. Deep breath in. And whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes. Allow yourself to come back into this online space, this learning community. So, winter's here. The Body Keeps the Score, the book that we have been studying by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. Today, we will be diving into part 4, the imprint of trauma. And part 4 consists of only 2 chapters. It is a brief section of the book compared to other parts, but do not take it lightly. It is a very dense part of this book. In chapter 11, we will be covering the chapter, Uncovering Secrets, the Problem of Traumatic Memory. And in chapter 12, we will be diving into the unbearable heaviness of remembering. And so a huge component of chapter 11 and chapter 12 give rise to the question of what is really memory? And we will be undergoing some of the concepts and studies that have been evolving for more than a century, with Charcot and Jeanette, and then the rise of psychoanalysis and whatnot. But I want to tell a story that really impacted me a year ago. I first heard it, and it is the story of Diederik Wolfsak's childhood. Diederik is the founder of Choose Again Society. It has a base in Costa Rica, in Lake Arenal. And in his book, Diederik is exploring the notion of memory. And he tells the story of when he was a little boy, he had this toy car that fell into the water, into a cold lake. And he asked his dad to retrieve the car. And the father does not retrieve it and actually reprimands him as a boy. And so all his life, he's woven this memory of neglect and of forgetfulness and of wanting to retrieve the car and not being able to, the toy. And later on, when he's an adult, him and his brother are having a conversation, older brother, and the brother tells the story of the toy. And the brother tells the story of the toy as if it were his own toy. So it wasn't Diederik's toy, it was his brother's toy, and that is what happened to his brother. So he, as a little boy, took on the story as if it was his own, but it was actually his brother. And I'm actually not sure if I'm retelling this story as specific details as in the book, but that also speaks to the question of memory. We are affected by how we remember, and we tell the stories that speak about our experience, and we will be delving more into that. So this book, part 4, starts with the Case of Julians. It's not really the name of this man, but for respect purposes, we use the name Julian. And his case is very poignant to illustrate the complexities of what traumatic memory is. Here's a quote from All Quiet on the Western Front, a book that was later burnt in the universities during Nazi Germany. It is a strange thing that all the memories have these 2 qualities. They are always full of quietness. That is the most striking thing about them. And even when things weren't like that in reality, they still seem to have that quality. They are soundless apparitions which speak to me by looks and gestures, wordless and silent, and their silence is precisely what disturbs me. So the case of Julian is a case that shows how traumatic memory floods us with sensations and images that are fragmented and incoherent, but that tell a story. And so there is, I think it's 2001, the case of Father Shanley in Boston raises suspicion as he gets accused, this priest gets accused of molesting children. And so this man, Julian, initially recalls this priest when he was a young boy. This priest was a kind man who'd been very supportive after his parents got divorced. So initially, when the case comes to light, when this priest is being held accountable for molesting children, Julian begins to recall, and he remembers this priest as a very good person who had actually been quite supportive in his early years. But suddenly he has this striking image of the priest looking at him as a young boy, and he's urinating. And after he has this memory, he calls on his supervisor at the military, and he says something along the lines of, "Have you heard what is happening in Boston? It happened to me too." And the moment he heard himself say those words, he knew for certain that he had been molested, even though he did not remember the details. And if you want to read the details, page 175. And so after he has these revelation of, I don't know exactly what happened, but I know that it happened to me, he was flooded with images and sensations, and to the point that he felt that he was going to break down completely. Then he started having panic attacks, and they were accompanied by seizures. He calls them epileptic fits or tics. Between panic attacks, he felt like a zombie. He receives administrative discharge from the military, and a year later, he begins to work with Dr. Bessel for therapy. And so what happens is that he begins to have incoherent and fragmentary images and isolated events of molestation. So it's not this one coherent narrative of this is what happened, and this is when it happened, and this is how it happened, and this is how it looked like. It was more bursts of smells and images and textures and fabrics that he was beginning to remember. And so it raises the question of memory. How come Julian remembered only after the news came out? And Bessel says that it is completely normal for traumatized people to lose all memories, all recollections of the event in question, only to regain access to them in bits and pieces at a much later date. And so it raises the question of illegitimacy of authority as a trauma itself. And this is my wording. This is not from Bessel, but illegitimacy of authority as a trauma is something that I gathered from the book, because initially, Julian, as a little boy, he did not like what was happening to him, what Father Shanley was doing to him, but he did not know how to stop it. And he even says Father Shanley was the closest thing to God in our neighborhood. So this has a lot to say about authority being illegitimate, and what do we do about it? You know, we have such loyalty to those who are in authority in our eyes, and who do we turn to? Who do we turn to when there is a malignant force coming from authority? And how do we even discern if it's malignant, right? Like Julian was very uncomfortable, but he didn't know how to stop it. And so he alternated as an adult between feeling sorry for the old man that the priest had become and simply wanting to get him into a room and kill him. And so we get into the notion of tolerating the unbearable. And there's this conflict that goes on between any person with trauma. In the case of Julian, it's two conflicting self-images. And in the case of all of us, there's always conflicting self-images. So Julian was confronted with this like big, tough Julian, who went to the military and was very structured and always knew how to flirt and knew how to do sports, and he was very athletic. And this self-image is confronted with a very small and very frightened Julian. So how do we make sense of a story of a parent forgetting, followed by fragmented, disturbing images, dramatic physical symptoms, and sudden reenactments? As a therapist treating people with a legacy of trauma, this is Bessel, of course. This is Bessel. As a therapist treating people with a legacy of trauma, my primary concern is not to determine exactly what happened, but to help them tolerate the sensations, emotions, and reactions they experience without being constantly hijacked by them. So first, primary, let's really feel what we feel, and then let's know what we know. Because this begins to heal self-blame, right? Julian had this very strong sense of self-blame. So we accept the trauma, it's not your fault. And it wasn't caused because you're horrible. It's not caused because there's a defect inside of you. No one ever could have deserved what happened to you. So as I said in the beginning, what is memory and what are the differences between normal versus traumatic memory, and how that shapes our understanding of psychology? So whether we remember a particular event at all and how accurate our memories are of it largely depends on how personally meaningful it was and how emotional we felt about it at the time. So the key factor is our level of arousal in terms to determine what an event was meant to us. So we all have memories associated with particular people, places, songs, smells that stay with us for a long time. The mind works according to schemes or maps, and incidents that fall outside of the established pattern are most likely to capture our attention. So Bessel speaks about how many of us have very precise memories of what September 11th was. And yet only a fraction of us will have very precise memories or particular memories about something that happened in September 10th, right? Because the more adrenaline, the more precise memory, in most cases, except with inescapable shock. So when we can't run away, then we fully shut down and there's an internal breakdown. So we all know how fickle memory is. Our stories change and we are constantly revising and changing and updating our own memories. So autobiographical memories are not precise reflections of reality. They are stories we tell to convey our personal take on our experience, right? So Diederik's toy is an example of that. My recalling of Diederik's toy story is an example of that. So we build upon things based on our own experience and interpretation. So getting into traumatic memory, there was a Harvard grant study of adult development from 1939 to the present that followed the psychological and physical health of more than 200 sophomore men. And this was quite an interesting study because they had no idea that World War II would occur. And so they had a lot of information with this study. And war narratives immediately, so what they discovered was that war narratives immediately post-war got compared to interviews 40 years later. So they first were interviewed in 1940, 1944, and then 40 years later, with the passage of time, for some people, events had been bleached of intense horror. So memories were updated and new events were added, and there was healing that happened. In contrast with those who developed PTSD and the narratives did not modify. So for the cases of PTSD, memories were preserved intact for 45 years after the war ended. So this is the imprint of traumatic memory. We cannot monitor what happens during a traumatic experience, right? We can reactivate the trauma in a lab, just like it was done for the brain scans of chapter 3 and chapter 4 with Ute. But when memory traces of the original sounds, images, and sensations are reactivated, the trauma reoccurs, right? So the frontal lobe shuts down. We can't put feelings into words, nor can we integrate the raw data that is coming from the sensations that our body is experiencing. So the emotional brain takes over, expressing its activation through channels of emotional arousal, body physiology, and muscular action. And under ordinary conditions, these two memory systems, the rational and the emotional, are able to collaborate to produce an integrated response. But what happens when we have high arousal, the other parts of the brain disconnect. And we no longer have the components necessary for proper storage and integration. And what this does is that it fragments our sensory and emotional traces. So images, sounds, and sensations are fragmented. So there's little to no story, like Julian. What happened? I don't know. But there's all these sensations that come up. And there's this interesting images and sounds and smells. But there's no story yet. And as we uncover the secrets of trauma, the nature of traumatic memory begins to systematically excuse me. Let me go back to my notes. Okay, so the nature of traumatic memory begins to be systematically studied in the 19th century with this phenomenon called railway spine, a psychological aftermath of railroad accidents that include memory loss. And we'll get into the case of Lelon, I think it's the name of the patient, that gets in a horse accident and he thinks that he lost his legs, but he didn't, but then his legs are paralyzed. So we'll get into that soon. For now, the study of hysteria begins. And hysteria comes from the Greek, meaning womb. So initially, hysteria is understood as an affliction of malingering and unstable women. So it goes from, this is, unstable women have hysteria, they're crazy, to a window into the mysteries of the mind and the body. So hysteria is a mental disorder characterized by emotional outbursts, susceptibility to suggestion, unexplainable paralysis, and muscle contraction. It's quite interesting because what hysteria does, the study of hysteria, is to open a window into the mysteries of the mind and the body. So this is Pierre Janet, Jean-Martin Charcot, Sigmund Freud, who are all pioneers in neurology and psychiatry with the study of psychosomatic symptoms, which they described. Sigmund Freud was a student of Breuer, who was a student of Charcot. So they say embodied memory and lack of language is what they understand as hysteria, right? I think this is genius. Embodied memory, but there's lack of language. So the body remembers, but there's lack of language. So trauma is at the root of hysteria. That's what they discovered, particularly childhood abuse. Now, there's all this political interest, and Bessel is great at telling historical events of how how politics influenced studies of the mind, right? Like, what would it mean for these people in Vienna to say that it is childhood abuse that is behind these cases of hysteria. What would that implicate to their own families, to their own father, to their own grandfather? So he gets into that. But traumatic memories were called pathogenic secrets or mental parasites, because as much as the sufferers wanted to forget whatever had happened, their memories kept forcing themselves into consciousness, trapping them in an ever-renewing present of existential horror. Hysteria offered a scientific explanation for phenomena such as demonic possession states, witchcraft, exorcism, and religious ecstasy, which I think is fantastic. So here's an image. It's been colored by to convey Charcot studying hysteria in La Salpêtrière. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but this was a research laboratory in modern hospital that before used to be an asylum for the poor in Paris. And then it got converted into a research laboratory where so many of the insights of psychoanalysis were born. So Lilog is the patient I was talking about. In 1889 was Charcot's patient. He had been in an accident with a horse-drawn cart. And after the accident, he could not remember the accident. He developed paralysis of his legs. Simple as that. Just developed paralysis in his legs. He can't remember. So that's quite interesting. He's somatizing something that happened to him. So as Charcot was very interested in measuring these physical conditions and symptoms of patients, on the one side, very tangible, Jeanette was in this metaphysical research. He was so invested in trying to discover what was going on inside of their minds, right? It's a more spiritual perspective. And Jeanette writes l'automatisme psychologique. I don't know how to pronounce that. If there's any French people here, please help me. This book is, this paper is written in 1889, in which Pierre Jeanette proposes that at the root of what we now call PTSD is the experience of vehement emotions, explaining that after having been traumatized, people automatically keep repeating certain actions. So what Freud later referred to as the repetition compulsion. So people repeat certain actions, emotions, and sensations related to the very trauma. And there's some very interesting stories of how this plays out even today, right? So there is the case of a patient that Bessel saw much later after the VA in Boston, who had survivor's guilt from the war, and he would every year every year when the anniversary of his friend's death came around, he would pretend that he had a gun inside his pocket, but really it was his fingers, and he would pretend to rob this place, giving enough time for the policeman to come. So he was just repeating the trauma. And there's another case of a woman in a bar as well. So there's this tendency to repeat. And Jeanette, while studying, okay, so there's tendency to reenact, but there's also a tendency to disassociate and not remember, to split off. And there's a tendency to not remember at a very high cost, which we will see. So we begin to understand the difference between narrative memory. So narrative memory, the stories that people tell themselves and other people about their trauma, and traumatic memory. We see the case of Irene, a young woman who was hospitalized following her mother's death from tuberculosis. This is in page 181. And Irene is an in such a level of distress that when her mother passes away, she cannot accept, she's in complete denial that her mom has passed away, and she cares for her body all night after the mom has passed away, and her dad is drunk and lay passing her out, and she's just trying to help her mom come to life again. And so she gets into the mental institution at La Salpêtrière, and comes into a medical relationship with Pierre Janet, who helps her slowly integrate what happened and helps her make her memories complete. So there's a bed, an empty bed next to Irene's bed, and Irene reenacts this whole scene of trying to revive her mother. And slowly, with time, she is able to tell Jeanette what happened. So it takes her like 4 months to recreate this whole scenario of caring for her mom. And then it takes her less than a minute to tell what happened, but she tells it in a way that's complete, because the memory is accompanied by the affect. And the memory is accompanied by the appropriate feelings to that memory. So there's a sense of completion. Memory, appropriate feelings, there's a marriage there. So traumatic memories are precipitated by specific triggers. So as we know in Julian's case, a big trigger for him to begin this outburst of memories is a comment that her girlfriend tells him. It's a very seductive comment, benign in its complete form. And he gets so triggered by this comment because it reminds him of these memories of Father Shanley molesting him. And in the case of Irene, there's a bed that reminds of her caring for her mother. So when one element of traumatic experience is triggered, then other elements are automatically likely to follow. And so what we're trying to get to is the state of acknowledging, okay, this was then, and this is now. Ordinary memory is adaptive and changes, and it is essentially social. So in ordinary memory, we have a story to tell for a specific purpose. But reenactments are frozen in time. So they are unchanging, and they are always lonely, humiliating, and alienating experiences that serve no purpose at all, right? So when Julian hears when Julian hears his girlfriend say, "You give such good head," he is so triggered that he tells her something along the lines of, "You say that again and I will kill you." And after they both recover from the shock of him saying that, they cry, and there's this sense of like, oh, what is the purpose of this? There's this part that needs to express the anger and the rage, and yet by reenacting it, does it serve a purpose? And then there's the purpose of disassociation, or the action, really. The action, the will to disassociate, the will to, instead of reenact, the will to split off. Or first we disassociate and then we reenact, to split off and isolate the imprint of these memories. And I want to read a passage from page 182. So if you have your book, I invite you to turn it to page 182 for a short reading on disassociation. So we're going paragraph 1 to on paragraph 3 of page 182. Jeanette coined the term dissociation to describe the splitting off and isolation of memory imprints that he saw in his patients. He was also prescient about the heavy cost of keeping these traumatic memories at bay. He later wrote that when patients disassociate their traumatic experience, they become attached to an insurmountable obstacle. So that's the price. You let go of the memory, but then a part of you attaches to this insurmountable obstacle. Unable to integrate their traumatic memories, they seem to lose their capacity to assimilate new experiences as well. I'll read that again. Unable to integrate their traumatic experiences, their traumatic memories, they seem to lose their capacity to assimilate new experiences as well. So you unconsciously choose to not remember, to not integrate, and then later in life, you cannot integrate other things. Basically, it is as if their personality has definitely stopped at a certain point and cannot enlarge anymore by the addition or assimilation to new elements. He predicted that unless they became aware of the split of elements and integrated them into a story that happened in the past, but was over now, they would experience a slow decline in their personal and professional functioning. This phenomenon has now been well documented in contemporary research. So disassociation prevents the trauma from becoming integrated within the conglomerated, ever-shifting stores of autobiographical memory. I don't know why that word is so difficult for me to pronounce. So that's paragraph 4. Dissociation prevents the trauma from becoming integrated within the conglomerated, ever-shifting stores of autobiographical memory, in essence, creating a dual memory system, which we'll speak later on splitting. Normal memory integrates the elements of each experience into the continuous flow of self-experience by a complex process of association. Think of a dense but flexible network where each element exerts a subtle influence on many others. But in Julian's case, the sensations, thoughts, and emotions of the trauma were stored separately as frozen, barely comprehensible fragments. PTSD is disassociation. The goal of treatment would be association, integrating the cut-off elements of the trauma into the ongoing narrative of life, so that the brain can recognize that was then and this is now. And this is the beginning of the talking cure, the origins of the talking cure. So Brewer cites Charcot and Jeanette by saying hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. Memories are not subject to the wearing away process of normal memories, but persist for a long time with astonishing freshness. Unlike other memories of the past, these memories are not at the patient's disposal, right? So this is the beginning of psychoanalysis. Unlike other memories, patients have no control over these memories and the sensations that they come up with. So if a person does not remember, he is likely to act out. And they use a lot of he because this was, of course, a patriarchal moment in time. But actually, Bessel he puts in hyphenated the H. So he, she reproduces it, not as memory, but as action. He repeats it without knowing. And in the end, we understand that this is his way of remembering. That's Freud in Inhibitions and Anxiety, 1914. So we come to this magical moment in the history of understanding the mind where association begins to become very useful and clear. Once there's memory and affect, something becomes complete. So the recollections without affect almost invariably produces no results. So if you open your book to page 183, we'll read from The Legacy of Brewer and Freud. Actually, I misspelled this. Practice, not perfection. So we found, to our great surprise at first, that each individual hysterical symptom immediately and permanently disappeared when we had succeeded in bringing clearly to light the memory of the event by which it was provoked, and in arousing its accompanying affect. And when the patient had described the event in the greatest possible detail and had put the affect into words, recollection without affect almost invariably produces no result. Hence, it is really important to recall the event that happened with the appropriate emotions or the appropriate affects towards it. There is this passage in also page 183 that I've found extremely moving. It says, allowing strangulated affect to find a way out through speech and subjects it to associative correction by introducing it into normal consciousness. And this to me is the premise of psychotherapy, and it's the premise of healing, right? It is the essence of becoming whole, of allowing those parts that we had before repressed, those strangulated affects, those strangulated memories to integrate. And that's also the premise of CBT, telling the story of the trauma in great detail to help people leave it behind. So cases such as the ones that Freud, Jeanette, and Charcot encountered continue to occur today, which raises a very critical question. How can doctors, police officers, or social workers recognize that someone is suffering from traumatic stress as long as he reenacts rather than remembers? How can patients themselves identify the source of their behavior? If their history is not known, they are treated, or they will be treated, as criminals rather than being helped to integrate the past. And this really brings to light so many social problems that we have nowadays. And I think that these questions are being posed as Bessel is posing these questions as a visionary. It's very hopeful to imagine a future where this would be possible, where these questions are being asked. Instead of pointing fingers, there is a willingness and an open heart to integrate the experiences that the triggering experiences from a traumatic past, if that makes sense. It's very hopeful. And yet, with all of this evidence, traumatic memory comes to trial. So it comes into the jury again, and this was very triggering to me. So I'm going to take a sip. So traumatic memory is taken to trial. This was not the only time. So we go back to Father Shanley, where 12 men claimed that they were molested, but only Julian testified in trial. And in February 2005, the priest was found guilty. In 2007, 2 years later, his attorney filed a motion for a new trial challenging the Shanley's convictions, saying that traumatic memories are not really scientific evidence, but junk science. And almost 100 leading psychiatrists and psychologists from around the US, but also from 8 different countries, signed a brief stating that repressed memory has never been shown to exist and that it should never have been held as evidence. However, in 2010, the court upheld Shanley's conviction, remaining their position as him being guilty. And this ends chapter 11, and it takes us to chapter 12, the unbearable heaviness of remembering. I just realized I was always on the... There we go. Chapter 12, the unbearable heaviness of remembering. The image that you see is a balancing, what's the name of this activity? Balancing on a thread. And it's a Jungian image from Marion Woodman's book, Dancing in the Flames. And I found this image very appropriate according to my own interpretation. Of course, it may or may not resonate with you, but I found it very expressive of this notion of the unbearable heaviness of remembering. So there's this pressure, something heavy is, it's this pressure. And yet there's this one steady line that we must balance on, and carrying our own weight, balancing through life. A quote from Katie Cannon opens the chapter. She says, "Our bodies are the texts that carry the memories, and therefore remembering is no less than reincarnation come to life." The unbearable heaviness of remembering. From 1893 to the present, interest in the inner landscape and the imprint of trauma has risen and fell and risen again. So we are in this constant conversation since 1983, but really, I mean, shamans have been dealing with trauma for a very, very long time, since the human spirit. But there's this conversation now, is it real? Is traumatic memory real? And although it was shunned away for a little bit, then psychoanalysis regained popularity with the outbreak of World War I in 1914, confronting medicine and psychology with bizarre symptoms from the veterans, unexplained medical conditions, and memory loss. So there's this bizarre physical postures and strange verbal utterances and terrified facial expressions and tics, the physical embodied expressions of trauma. A memory that is inscribed simultaneously in the mind as interior images or words and on the body. So a little bit of history. So in World War I, patients are diagnosed with this condition called shell shock. And when you are diagnosed with shell shock, which is basically what it sounds like, PTSD, you're entitled to treatment and you receive a disability pension. But then this was happening a lot. So they created this new diagnosis called neurasthenia. And this gave them, the patients who were diagnosed with neurasthenia, neither treatment nor pension. And it was up to the physician which diagnosis a soldier would receive. Too many people are showing up with shell shock. We cannot give pension and treatment to all of them. Let's create this new condition and let's just leave them at the mercy of their own devices. And this is actually a very sad chapter because it proves over and over again how afraid we are of truth. And it's quite interesting because although the chapter is focused on personal traumatic memory, I think that there's also this traumatic collective memory, right? Collective trauma of speaking of our own thoughts and afraid of our own humanity and afraid of our own darkness. Massive collective repression in order to control, and this thirst for power, thirst of power that is at all costs, right? Even if in 1916 at Somme, the commander sent this flower British youth to death or mutilation, right? Doesn't matter. All for the cost of power, or anything for the cost of power. 1922, the British government issued the South Bureau report to eliminate shell shock. The official view was that well-trained troops, properly led, would not suffer from shell shock, and that servicemen who had succumbed to the disorder were undisciplined and unwilling soldiers. And this again repeats in World War II, when they say it is not war which makes sick. This is from the United States. It is not war which makes men sick, but that sick men cannot fight wars. So this massive denial, collective denial of the effects of trauma upon civilization. 1918, the United States troops were promised $1.25 for each day served overseas. So that would be the equivalent of $19.30 today, 2021. So that's an estimate of $7,000 a year. And this was never paid to them. So the veterans, in response to this, during the Great Depression, decide to camp outside a mall, and the army sends troops and 6 tanks to clear out the veterans complaining. And the camps were burnt, and the soldiers, so the veterans, were attacked, and they were never paid anything. So if you take your book to page 188. So this is from All Quiet on the Western Front, the book that then was burned in Nazi Germany, from a German writer, Erich Maria Remarque. I am aware that I, without realizing it, have lost my feelings. I don't belong here anymore. I live in an alien world. I prefer to be alone, not disturbed by anybody. They talk too much. I can't relate to them. They are only busy with superficial things. And this book was translated into 25 languages. And the affect that comes to me in reading this, I had the fortune of being born and raised in Costa Rica, which is a country that abolished its army in the 40s. So this is very unfamiliar to me. And reading these recollections is extremely heartbreaking. I'm sorry. I think somewhere in the book later it comes up that trauma is unbearable, unbelievable, and it's another category, but it's just unbelievable that this would happen. And yet it does. And the reason why this book was burnt, I think my emotional response shows why these books were burnt, right, in the coming of World War II. So awareness gives power, which gives agency. And the rising of the Third Reich was no longer acceptable, right? So those books were burnt so that nobody would know and history would repeat itself. So denial of the consequences of trauma can wreak havoc with the social fabric of society. The refusal to face the damage caused by the war and the intolerance of weakness played an important role in the rise of fascism and militarism around the world in the 1930s. The extortionate war reparations of the Treaty of Versailles, I've only learned this word in Spanish, Versailles, further humiliated an already disgraced Germany. German society, in turn, dealt ruthlessly with its own traumatized war veterans who were treated as inferior creatures. This cascade of humiliations set the stage for the ultimate debasement of human rights under the Nazi regime, the moral justification for the strong to vanquish the inferior, the rationale for the ensuing war. So culture shapes the expression of traumatic stress. So we've just seen is the new phase of trauma, with motion pictures getting created. We have the opportunity to see this live recordings that were done in 1946 of the predominant treatment of war neurosis at the time. They used hypnosis. And so there's this motion picture, Let There Be Light. You can find it on YouTube. And we see how doctors are still patriarchal and the patients are still very terrified young men, but they're manifesting their trauma differently. So in World War I, we see reports of soldiers having facial tics and collapsing with paralyzed bodies. But the following generation in the soldiers of World War II, they talk and they cringe and their bodies still keep the score. So their stomachs are upset, their hearts race, and they're overwhelmed with panic. But the trauma did not just affect their bodies. So there was this permeability into the mind. And the treatment that was done with hypnosis allowed them to find words for the things that they were too afraid to remember. So through hypnosis, they were able to recall the terror and the survivor's guilt and their guilt and their conflicting loyalties. And as trauma gets rediscovered, there's this quite interesting, it really keeps shocking me how before the Vietnam War, when Bessel was working at the VA, so the Veterans Association, I think is what it stands for, there were no books on war trauma at the library. How interesting. But after the Vietnam War, came numerous studies and the formation of scholarly organizations and the inclusion of trauma diagnosis. So now we have PTSD as a result of that in the professional literature. At the same time, interest in trauma was exploding in the general public. Some misguided textbooks denied the horrible effects of incest. That's actually quite shocking. But there was this movement, this feminist movement, bringing trauma awareness, and it emboldened tens of thousands of trauma survivors. And there's two books that Bessel mentioned that came up for the general public, The Courage to Heal, published in 1988, and Trauma Recovery from 1992. So experts testifying on behalf of the Catholic Church were claiming that the memories of childhood sexual abuse were unreliable at best, again, and that the claims being made by alleged victims more likely resulted from false memories implanted in their minds by therapists who were over-sympathetic, credulous, or driven by their own agendas. So during this period, Bessel examines more than 50 adults who, like Julian, remembered being abused by priests. And half of the cases were denied in court, which is very sad. So we go back into these, the question of normal versus traumatic memory again, and what doctors encounter from a new light, and what doctors encounter in the emergency rooms or in psychiatric wards and on the battlefield is very different from what scientists observe in their safe, well-organized laboratories, right? So the events that take place in the lab will never be considered equivalent to the conditions under which traumatic memories are created. You cannot induce traumatic memory. The original imprint of trauma cannot be laid there. If you want to study traumatic memory, you have to study the memories of the people who have actually been traumatized, right? This is something that cannot be faked. And so they undertake the study of, I found this so interesting. They came up with this posters and they put it all over Boston, and Bessel and his colleague, and the poster said, "Has something terrible happened to you that you cannot get out of your mind? Call us and we will pay you $10 for participating in the study." So I think 60 people signed for this study, and they get asked questions about memory in order to be in order to understand normal memory versus traumatic memory. So they are asked, what is something that you think that you will never forget that is not traumatic? And so people recall, memories such as weddings and births and graduations and events from the past that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. But in contrast, the traumatic memories were quite disorganized, and especially those of childhood abuse. So traumatic memories were dissociated, and different sensations enter the brain and are not properly assembled into a story or a piece of autobiography. So recalling the trauma and the associated affects does not necessarily resolve it. So most of these people had been in therapy or had been telling the story for a long period of time, and they still, it was still unresolved. So finding words to describe what has happened to you can be transformative. It is very important if you incorporate language into traumatic experience. That's the premise of psychoanalysis, right? But putting into language what has happened does not abolish flashbacks, nor improve concentration, does not stimulate involvement in your life, and does not reduce hypersensitivity to disappointments. So it's not complete, right? And then begins this listening to survivors of trauma. And if you turn your page to 1997, there's this piece of listening to survivors in Auschwitz. So refer to page 197, paragraph, the first paragraph. In his book, Holocaust Testimonies, The Ruins of Memory, published in 1991, Lawrence Longer writes about his work in the Fortuna Video Archive at Yale University. He says, listening to accounts of Holocaust experience, we unearth a mosaic of evidence that constantly vanishes into bottomless layer of incompletion. We wrestle with the beginnings of a permanently unfinished tale, full of incomplete intervals, face spectacle of a faltering witness, often reduced to a distressed silence by the overwhelming solicitations of deep memory. If you were not there, it's difficult to describe and say how it was. How men function under such stress is one thing, and how you communicate and express that to somebody who has never knew. I'll start again. How men function under such stress is one thing. And then how you communicate and express that to somebody who never knew that such a degree of brutality exists seemed like a fantasy. So refer to the next paragraph. It's a recount of Charlotte Delbo about her experience in Auschwitz. She says, the self who was in the camp isn't me. It isn't the person who is here opposite to you. No, it's too unbelievable. And everything that happened to this other self, the one from Auschwitz, does not touch me now. Me doesn't concern me. So distinct are deep memory and common memory. Without the split, I wouldn't have been able to come back to life. She comments that even words have dual meaning. Otherwise, someone in the camps who has been tormented by thirst for weeks would never again be able to say, I'm thirsty, let's make a cup of tea. Thirst after the war has once more become a currently used term. On the other hand, if I dream of the thirst I felt in the extermination facilities in Auschwitz, I see myself as I was then, haggard, bereft of reason, tottering. So Langer hauntingly concludes, Who can find a proper grave for such damaged mosaics of the mind, where they may rest in pieces? Life goes on, but in two temporal directions at once. The future unable to escape the grip of a memory laden with grief. The essence of trauma, it is overwhelming, unbelievable, and unbearable. Each patient demands that we suspend our sense of what is normal and accept that we are dealing with a dual reality. The reality of a relatively secure and predictable present that lives side by side with the ruinous, ever-present past. We turn the page to 198. We encounter Nancy. We meet Nancy. And Nancy, whoops. Let me arrange this. Put this down here. So we meet Nancy. Nancy is the director in a Midwestern hospital who undergoes what would be a usually routine outpatient surgery, which is the burning of her fallopian tubes to prevent pregnancy. And in the surgery, she was given insufficient anesthesia. So she awakens during the operation, and she remains awake nearly to the end of the operation, experiencing the full horror of her situation. However, she was given a muscle relaxant to prevent muscle contraction during surgery, which prevented her from moving or speaking or expressing any of the horrors that she was experiencing. And so this was very traumatizing event because she couldn't make sense of her story and she couldn't believe that that had happened. After the surgery, she cannot put the pieces together, but everything that is iron triggers her in a way that is unexplainable, overwhelming, and unbearable. She sees the hair straightener and she goes crazy. She cannot make toast. Anything that's iron or heat is driving her crazy. She doesn't understand. And slowly piecing the pieces together, her entire focus becomes, bringing awareness that this can happen in order to free herself from the intrusions of these memories and the traumatic imprint into her everyday life. She does not sue the hospital, but rather wants to create more awareness. And she later needs another surgery to which Dr. Bessel accompanies her to establish a feeling of safety. And there's a progress into her recovery. She writes to Bessel emails that portray her recovery. They're quite impactful. If you haven't had a chance to read them, they can be very cringe-provoking. I don't know if that's the correct word, but that's the word that comes to mind. It's a very traumatic story of being tortured while alive, of not being able to understand what is happening, of feeling like she should be totally unconscious and yet feeling every single one thing that happens inside of her body, feeling everything. And she begins to heal through the work of integrating and remembering. And in later recounts, when the book is being published, she tells Dr. Bessel that she left her CBT therapy because she no longer found it useful. And she started Pilates So she started doing Pilates, and she also started psychodynamic therapy, which is a new version of a newer version, modern psychoanalysis that uses a lot of body movement and Jungian psychology. It draws a lot on Jung and draws a lot on Melanie Klein, which is one of my favorite psychoanalysts. But speaking of my favorite psychoanalysts, and before we end this piece of the evening, I would like to introduce you to Marion Woodman. Marion Woodman is a Jungian psychoanalyst that has influenced my life since 2013. She was first introduced to me by my therapist and my guru, Shunyamurti, when I lived at the ashram, and I showed particular interest for Jungian studies. And I have two brief videos that I think bring into completion some of the things that we've spoken about. So I will click on the videos and we can watch them together.
Healing means making whole. And very often in our culture, it's confused with curing. Healing means making whole. And very often in our culture, it's confused with curing, which brings in an outside medicine or surgery to interfere with the inner process. So that as I see healing, it's allowing our psyche to work with us to bring wholeness to our being. How we see ourselves determines what happens to us in the day, in our lives. If we have no respect for ourselves, we do not love ourselves, that will carry over to other people and they will regard us the same way we regard ourselves. And it's very, very sad because some people feel that whatever performance they put on, they are not lovable.
Were you able to listen to her audio? I might have to do this again, just to make sure. So I want to share.
Healing means making whole. And very often in our culture, it's confused with curing, which brings in an outside medicine or surgery to interfere with the inner process. So that as I see healing, it's allowing our psyche to work with us to bring wholeness to our being. How we see ourselves determines what happens to us in the day, in our lives. If we have no respect, how we see ourselves determines what happens to us in the day, in our lives. If we have no respect for ourselves, we do not love ourselves, that will carry over to other people and they will regard us the same way we regard ourselves. And it's very, very sad because some people feel that whatever performance they put on, they are not lovable.
That's Marian Woodman. If you liked her tone, if you resonated with her message, I highly recommend watching the documentary Dancing in the Flames. It's one of the best documentaries on psychology that I've come across. So with this, let's inhale and take our arms up towards the sky, lengthening through the spine, reaching with our fingertips. So bring a lot of energy to your fingertips, really reach high up, high up, high up, and then melt your shoulder blades down towards the ground. So there's this dual action of reaching with your hands up towards the sky, and then let the shoulder blades melt towards the ground and come down towards one another. Interlace your fingers behind your back, behind your chest. That would be quite hard. I need a session of integration. Interlace your fingers behind the occipital ridge of your head and let your head rest here. And gently sway your head from side to side, allowing one elbow to come to the midline, drawing the opposite elbow back, and the same the other side. Just rocking here, side to side, allowing the weight of the head to rest on your hands. Little rocking and twisting. Allowing the rib cage to expand with each in-breath and emptying out the lungs with the exhale. And gently allowing this movement of side to side rocking to become slower and slower, gradually coming back to stillness, and use the weight of the hands to bring the elbows towards one another at the midline, and let your chin come towards your chest as you rest your head, using the pressure of the hands to elongate the back of your neck. In breath, lifting the chin up, and using your fingertips to massage the back of your neck. And then your jaw, relax your jaw, doing any movements that might feel good. And shaking your hands, play the piano, wash the camera of your computer, and shake the hands again. Take a deep breath in through your nose, rest your hands on your lap, and on the exhale, purse your lips and let it go. In breath through the nose. And exhale. In through the nose. And exhale. Shake your hands one more time. And if you want to shake your chest, I recommend a full Osho shaking session after this session. But this was part 4. And I want to remind you that part 5, Paths to Recovery, was really the reason why we started this book club, to talk about the effect of yoga, the yoga practice and movement and breath work in healing. So don't miss that. It's the reason why we started part 5, Paths to Recovery. We'll go over it in January 5th. I'm Prema. Maggie and I will be going over part 5, so I hope that you're there. I wish you happy holidays, whichever tradition or ritual resonates in your heart. May it be the opportunity to bear new life and to open the heart to forgiveness and to gratitude. And for the year to come, may you soak the blessing that you are. May you acknowledge that you're a gift to this world and that your medicine is what we all need. Namaste. And I look forward to hearing your comments in the discussion. Feel free to write to me or to Maggie if you have further questions, and we will do our best to answer it. I look forward to hearing from you and hearing your insights on this 2 chapters that were extremely impactful, as we saw. So here, in all my humanness and in all my rawness and vulnerability and transparency, the light in me honors the light in you, and the dark in me honors the dark in you, and everything in between. Namaste. And happy holidays. Ready for a shaking session. See you soon. Bye.